Shabbat shalom, Shabbat shalom to all the waywalkers out there and the Garrett that sojourn with us. We are back here again on another Shabbat. I'm on Eastern time here, so the sun is still up and hasn't set yet. And so we are still observing the Most High Shabbat. Now, we have a great topic here today, a very hot topic, a very controversial topic, has a long-standing history of controversy. And we're going to take the historical, the textual, and the linguistical context to address this problem. I see those of you guys that are in the room, Sister Sheikah, I think I saw Sister Peggy. Appreciate you guys tuning in. For those of you guys that are already tuned in, please go ahead and like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already done so. As I was stating, this is a very hot topic. It is a very controversial topic. I got the final motivation to do this based on a most recent debate in which you guys will see is actually part of an experiment which I am performing. And so, based on that debate, the topic being, can we be justified by the law given to Moshe or Moses according to Paul? And so there was a very informative debate. It was a part of the experiment, as you guys will see, in testing these conclusions, which this logical, Bible-based, and scientific study has led me to. So you guys are going to want to get your pens and pads out, your pencils, because we're going to be going through a lot of information here, most high willing. We're going to continue this on for the next couple Shabbats, the most high willing, inshallah. And we're going to address this issue of justification and the juxtaposition of the law versus or contra Paul. So we're not going to belabor the point here. We're going to get right into the presentation. As I stated, this is actually part one of a series. And in this part, let's see if I can get this thing. There we go. And we're dealing with the law versus Paul. The law versus Paul. The prevailing view is that Paul taught against the law given to Moshe, or what's called the Mosaic law. That is the prevailing view and has been for about 2,000 years now. But what we're going to do is put the theology aside, put what we were taught in Bible school, Sunday school, and at home, and we're going to test this, right? We're going to take a look at what Paul clearly stated himself. We're going to take a look at what the law says itself. And then we're going to do what's called a comparative analysis, right? Now, most of the theories that are prevalent today are based off of purely tradition. What I've been taught, what I've been told, what I thought, what my denomination subscribes to. We're going to put all of that aside, and we're going to use this scientific method. We're going to combine that with the biblical method of precept upon precept, right? Right? And biblical hermeneutics. When we talk about exegesis, we're talking about observation, interpretation, and application, right? These all are pretty much the same thing. And so when we're dealing with the scientific method and we have a problem, the first thing that we do is turn that problem into a question, right? Right? And we're going to do that. I've already done that. I've already been through these steps to put together this Bible class, this scripture lesson, this Sabbath class. I've already done that. But what I'm going to do is take a step back and walk you through the process of what I've already done, just to show that the conclusions of this series is based on logical processes and factual data. All right. So now I brought this into a question. I did my research already. I'm going to present my hypothesis here. I'm going to present the research here. That experiment there is what I was speaking about earlier in these debates, right? I don't just debate just to hear myself speak or to show how much knowledge that I have. It's an experiment. It's to test these conclusions and see what those who oppose or would oppose these conclusions what their rebuttals are, what their responses are, how they respond to this information, right? I've already done my analysis, and now what you're getting is the published form of that, right? And so here's the problem. Getting right into the text, this is a Bible study, so you guys certainly want to have your Bibles out, right? This is a biblical study. And so the problem is, remember, we said we're going to identify the problem, and then what we're going to do is turn that problem into a question that we can research to find answers for through various experiments, right? Right? The Bible says to prove all things, right? And so the problem that we have here is that the law says one thing. Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter number 4, verse number 8 in the King James Version. And what nation, this is the Most High speaking here now, and what nation is there so great that have statutes and judgments, watch this, so righteous as all this law? And if I'm screaming, you guys let me know. My mic has a shortage in it, and I don't want to distract. Let me turn the volume down here a bit. Let's see how that works out. So you guys, because I don't have my mic, and I get complaints and, you know, criticism from those that are detractors toward the message, mostly a lot of the Pauline Christian apologists there. And so the problem here is that the law says this: the Most High, in what we call the law, the Torah, the divine teachings given to Moshe, he says in Devarim chapter number 4, verse 8, and what nation is there so great that have statutes and judgment so righteous as all this law, which I set before you this day? Not the one that's coming, but this one that I'm giving you now. It is righteous. And when we get into part 2, we're going to actually define that word righteous according to the English, according to the Greek, and the Hebrew etymology. We're going to get into the usage of it. But just to give you the cliff notes and a sneak peek, righteous is the same word as justify, right? Or justification, same word. So the Most High says here that this law in itself is righteous, and it is justification. Don't worry, I'm going to back that up, like I said, in part number 2, which we'll get to, Most High willing, on next week. Now, Paul says, according to the prevailing view, in Galatians chapter number 2 and verse number 21, I do not frustrate the grace of the Elohim, for if righteousness come by the law, then Christ is dead in vain. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that these two things are contradictory according to the prevailing modern day interpretation and the accepted interpretation of the book of Galatians in general, and this text in particular. And so when we compare these two texts, the law says the Most High himself, God himself, Yahuwah himself, says that the law in itself and of itself is righteous. Paul, on the other hand, says, according to the prevailing view, righteousness doesn't come by the law. So here's the problem. Who do we listen to? Right? Who has the correct? Is it the Most High himself or the prevailing view of what Paul said? right? There are various interpretations and methods by which the prevailing view has failed to reconcile these texts. This is why we have critics. This is why we have scoffers saying your Bible is not homogeneous. You have the Most High saying one thing, and you have Paul saying another thing on the other hand. It's a problem. A problem that this lesson, if you continue on through it, will solve. Right? Okay, Deuteronomy, Devarim, chapter number 6, verse number 25. And it shall be our righteousness. Now, this is Israel. Sometime, notice that this is chapter 6. The verse we read before was in chapter 4. So this is close on the heels of the Most High himself saying that, that the law and the judgments and the statutes were righteous. In other words, they were just. In other words, they are biblically defined by the Most High himself as justification. And so Deuteronomy 6 says, and it shall be our righteousness. It's a clear definition of what righteousness is according to ancient Israel, right? Those folk that just received the laws, statutes, and commandments of the Elohim, right? Devarim 6 and 25, and it shall be our righteousness if we observe to do all these commandments before Yahuwah Eloheinu, or the Lord our God, as he have commanded us. So not only do them, but do them as he commanded. That's biblical definition of righteousness according to the Most High himself and according to ancient Israel. But then Paul, on the other hand, according to the prevailing view, says in the book of Romans 3 and 20, therefore by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. So now the prevailing view actually conflicts with the ancient Israelite view, or what's called in scholarship First Temple Judaism, right? Right? So Paul's version, according to the prevailing view that's promulgated in Christendom, is that this verse, these verses, Galatians 2 and 2 and Romans 3 and 20, is proving these things to the left that the Most High said, and that the ancient Israelites believed, that Paul was speaking against them. So there's a problem. There's a problem that needs a solution. It's a problem that's been around for 2,000 years. And we're going to answer that in this lesson, the Most High willing. So now, we got Paul versus the law, or the law versus Paul, I should say. But now let's take Paul and look at John, because some folk will say, well, there was the majority of folk, well, they didn't have the understanding in the Old Testament, in the Tanakh. They didn't understand that the new law, the new covenant would be about love and faith. And so there was necessarily a change to the law. Well, there's a problem with that as well, as we're going to see. A major problem that needs to be solved. And so Paul in Galatians chapter number 2, verse number 16 says, knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by the faith of Jesus Christ, or Yahusha HaMashiach, right? Even we have believed in Yahusha HaMashiach, that we might be justified by the pistis or faith of Hamashiach or the Christ, and not by the works of the law, right? For by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. That's the, well, I haven't even showed you guys yet, but this is the prevailing view. The prevailing view is that this is a dead ringer. Paul said we are not justified by the law. Sam, this is clear. What's the problem? Okay. Problem is his contemporary, the Apostle John, one who walked and talked with Hamashiach. He didn't come 5 years after the death, burial, and resurrection of Hamashiach, after the Kahal had begun, right? He didn't come after, he was there, right? Paul wrote, and also notice that we're talking about the book of Revelations. The book of Revelations was written between 95 and 98 AD, right? After the temple was destroyed, some 20, 30 years after the temple was destroyed, right? And so in the book of Revelations, the Apocalypse, the Apostle John says this: "And I saw the dead, small and great, stand before the Elohim, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of those things which were written in the books." How? According to their works. So now, John here is saying that at the day of judgment, folk are going to be judged according to their works, not according to what they believe, which is called pistis or faith by the prevailing view, but according to their works, right? So now here is another fundamental problem. Paul is clear: by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified, right? This is simple, right? That's what he said, right? According to the prevailing view. According to the prevailing view. But even an elementary school student would tell you that these two statements are contradictory. Paul does not, according to the prevailing view, agree with John. It's two different things, according to the prevailing view. Problem is, it's a conflict. The problem is that there's been no answers. Right? We do have attempts by the church fathers, Irenaeus, and all of them from the 2nd and 3rd century, and Origen and all of that, but they failed miserably. I don't know if we're going to get to it in this lesson. The Most High willing, it's only 3 parts. Try to keep it under an hour so that we don't lose the attention of you viewers, right? And so this is an obvious conflict. No one has answered this with any sensible in 2,000 years. 2,000. For those of you guys that don't believe me or want to challenge me, the platform will be open at the end of each session. Most High willing, I will open the platform up for questions. I will bring you on the platform. You can bring your evidence. not your opinions. I'm not wasting my time with opinions because I've been taking about 3 months now, 2-3 months to go through every scripture, every verse that deals with righteousness, every verse that deals with justice from Old to New Testament, hundreds of verses. So I'm just not going to waste my time dealing with folks that just bring opinions or logical fallacies. You're stupid. You're dumb. You're wrong. This is not right. Okay, well, what is right? Bring that data to the table and we're going to compare it just like we're doing now in a logical, I say again, method, right? And so Paul disagrees with John. John disagrees with Paul. So now we got the law, and now we got John, and now we're here with James. Paul says in Romans 3:28, therefore we conclude that a man is justified by faith, pistis, without the deeds of the law, right? It's clear according to the prevailing view and those who promulgate that view, it is absolutely clear. James, on the other hand, in the book of James 2:24 in the King James Version, says, ye see then how that by works a man is justified and not by faith only. I'm live, bro. Right? So we got Paul saying that by works a man is not going to be justified according to the prevailing view. Then we have James on the other hand that says, don't you know? And if you read up in the context, he calls him a vain man. That by works a man is justified. So now, who's right? Why is there a conflict if it's one spirit? For by one spirit are we all baptized? I would that you say the same thing. So why is James and Paul saying something different? And who should we listen to if there is a difference? Right? James being the half-brother of Hamashiach, the Christ himself, right? And the head of the Nazarene Kahal, which the world calls the church, right? So now we have a conflict here that needs to be addressed. It hasn't been addressed in any systematic or logical method that makes any kind of sense. Besides, oh, well, Paul, the only one that got the revelation, which makes no sense whatsoever. So the folk that walked and talked with Hamashiach for 3.5 years was personally mentored and tutored and discipled by him. They didn't get it. They missed the memo. So he had to bring Paul 5 years later, who never even walked and talked with the Hamashiach directly during his earthly ministry. He gave it to him. Does that make any sense? Because what that says is Christ's ministry, he failed. He failed to impart the truth to his disciples, the ones that he walked and talked with for 3.5 years. So the Most High had to bring in Paul. Right? I don't believe that, but this is the prevailing view. Right? We're going to take this objectively as much as possible because I am subjective. I don't subscribe to the prevailing view. Let me say that off the bat. But in order for us to be able to get to the truth, we got to see both sides of the coin. Not just take what I believe, not just take what I've been taught and run with it. We're going to look at both sides of the spectrum and we're going to test both of these theories and see which one is consistent. See which one homogenizes the biblical text. instead of this division that we have. Because in this text, if you let, and I've done it, hopefully I'll get to share some of the debates with you guys, both online as far as Facebook groups and all of that stuff, and in live debates. You will get to see this in action. You're going to get to see folks avoid this and ignore this. Oh, it's not a discrepancy. It's not a contradiction. It's not any of those things. I'm just not going to see that. Well, it's not a contradiction here, so I don't know what you're talking about, Sam. We can move on to continuing and say no, these are obvious contradictions. Obviously, obvious, right? You're not going to be justified by faith. By works. You're going to be justified by faith. James says a man is going to be justified by his works. John says that man is going to be judged according to his works, right? So we got John, we got James, and we got the law, right? John, James, and the law. All three says, I'm sorry, I didn't went up too far here. All three of them says, try to get back to where I was. All three of them says the law, John, and James. And James. All three. So now we can write this off and we could use the theory. Hey, listen, well, Paul got the revelation. They didn't get it. Right? But this next problem is going to throw you for a loop. Paul, according to the prevailing view, contradicts himself. This is why we have a major problem. In the same letter that he wrote to the Romans, right? Same letter, circa 58 AD. He says two different things. For not the hearers of the law are just before the Elohim, but the doers of the law shall be justified. Right? The doers of the law shall be, if you do the law, you will be justified. This is clear. Don't be fooled by well, you're taking it out of context. Before you get to any context, you have to observe exactly what the text is saying. State exactly what the text is saying. That's exegesis. Observation. Then you get the context to get an interpretation. And then you use that interpretation with your understanding of the way things are in the modern time. And you make it applicable to us today. Right? Folk want to jump context, have no clue what context is. What we're doing is putting Paul right now, we're putting Paul in context by his own words out of his own mouth. Come on now, right? So Romans 2:13, for not the hearers of the law are just before the Elohim, but the doers of the law shall be justified. Paul clearly says, they that do the law shall be justified. Don't care how you try to twist it or what have you. He said that, right? Romans 3:20, just one chapter over, we have, therefore, by the deeds of the law shall no flesh be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. According to the prevailing view, Romans 3:20 is used heavily by the proponents that say Paul taught against the law given to Moshe. He told us that we don't have to follow the law of Moses. He told us that we're not justified, we're not declared righteous by the law of Moses. Paul clearly told us that, right? Well, it's not so clear as you guys see. Romans 2:13, they that do the law shall be justified. Romans 3:20, according to the prevailing view, For by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified. Which one is it, Paul? Are we going to be justified if we do it? Or we're not going to be justified? Right? So we can explain away, or they can explain away, John, Paul was greater than John. He's the greatest apostle that ever lived. James, Paul is greater than James. He's the greatest apostle that ever lived. He the only one that got the truth. The law, well, Paul clearly told you, which is a circular argument, by the way. Paul clearly told you that we're not justified by the law, right? So now, but when we get to Paul contradicting himself, is Paul a liar? Is he schizophrenic? Or is the prevailing view inconsistent and contradictory in and of itself? I'm going to let you guys answer that, right? As we continue on in this text. And so the problem is we have the law, we have James, and we have John and Paul himself against Paul. This is a big problem. This is a problem that allows atheists to say, this is why I don't believe the book. Look at all of those contradictions in the Bible. And then when I ask Christians about it, they don't tell me anything logical. I've been to school. That stuff is rhetoric. That is nonsensical, right? You're justified, but you're not justified. The law says you're justified. James says you're justified. John says you're justified by your works. You're going to be judged by your works. Paul says something different. Problem. That's what we call inconsistent theology. It's not homogeneous. You got contradictions here. In other words, it is not sound doctrine, right? Right? Now, if you guys have questions, now that we're at this question section, go ahead. You can post your questions in there, but I'm looking at the PowerPoint, so I won't be able to get to them at the end. We'll also open up the panel. You can come on the panel. You can challenge the information, take the information to your pastor, the pope, the bishop, whomever. And we would certainly love to have a cordial discussion with them as part of our experiment, right? I just challenged the bishop from Church of God in Christ, I think the evangelism prelate or what have you, Bishop Henderson or Hankerson or what have you. Of course, he declined. But I did remind him that Matthew chapter number 18, Jude 1 and 3, 1 Peter 3 and 15 actually requires that he have a sit down with me. So we'll see what becomes of that. And if he doesn't, then we're going to go ahead and do a rebuttal video without him. But biblically, I'm required to let him know that I have an issue with the teaching. And that, I had a witness there with me that told him, bro, you wrong. And so now the Bible, according to Matthew chapter number 18, in the words of Hamashiach himself, and the Tanakh tells us that we need 2 or 3 witnesses. We got to bring the Kahal together. We got to bring our evidence to the table and discuss this. But if you have any questions, go ahead. I will certainly allow, or contradictions or whatever you guys want, we will allow you on the podium, so that on the panel, so that I was about to say the pulpit, so that you can so that you guys can get your questions answered and make your points or what have you. But now, remember, we talked about changing those problems. We're using the scientific method. We're changing this problem, these problems into questions. So what this series is going to do, it's going to answer these basic questions, logical questions that has relevance to the topic, right? What is the biblical definition of justification? It's one of the questions that we'll answer, right? Second question, what does Paul believe, observe, and teach, right? The third is, what does the law and the prophets teach, right? And the fourth is, how does Paul's teaching compare with the law and the prophets. So we're going to observe out of Paul's own words exactly what he believed, what he observed, and what he taught, right? And we're going to bring the historical. So that's called the textual evidence, right? Just letting the text, because the Bible is always our primary source. It is always the base of information, right? Which we judge history and philological etymologies and interpretations by, right? The Bible, what it says, the text itself. But what we're going to do also is get into the history. And a lot of folk don't know that what Acts is a primary source historical account. Primary source historical account, right? Of what Paul, mostly the latter chapters of what Paul did, where he traveled, what he preached, right? So we're going to use these resources to not just guess at or regurgitate what we've been told, but to actually get it from Paul himself, right? Then in part 2, we're going to get into not only defining the words, but we're going to go into the biblical text, the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and see exactly what the law and the prophets teach, right? Because Paul said, and I'm going to show you guys this is a little bit of a spoiler, but Paul emphatically said that he was teaching the law. Did you get that? Paul said that he was teaching the law, and I'm going to show you that. So now if he was teaching the law, then we have to define, the next step is logically, what does the law say? And then finally, how does Paul's teachings compare with the law and the prophets? There's a lot of theories out there, but folk don't put in the work to logically come up with sound doctrine and sound answers to these questions, right? So I told you guys, the scientific method, observation, we observe what's going on, we get our research, next stage, right? We do, and then we come up, based on the observation and the research, we come up with an hypothesis. My hypothesis is in 3 parts. It's really like a premise. I took it directly from the debate premise, which was the inspiration for this teaching session, right? One of the inspirations. Point number 1, Paul testified that he believed in everything. Testified, did you hear me? On more than one occasion. In everything written in the law of Moses. And on more than one occasion, he stated that he himself followed, observed, obeyed, and taught the law given to Moshe. Part 2, since Paul said he was teaching and following and observing the law given to Moshe. Sadly, let me stop there. Sadly, most individuals do not even realize this. Most folk that call themselves followers of the Christ, I've found this through my experience and my experiments online and on one-on-one debates, panel sessions, all of that. Folk will argue against this fact. This is not a theory. This is a biblical fact, right? It is written. Paul testified that he believed in everything written in the law of Moses. Actually, it didn't. Well, you're going to see what it says when we get to it. And on more than one occasion, he stated that he himself followed, observed, obeyed, and taught the law of Moses, right? The law of Moses teaches justification or righteousness. Remember, I told you guys these terms are used interchangeably. It's the very same word in the English, the Greek, and the Hebrew. So that's a dead issue right there. These are the same words. So for some of you, well, he's supposed to be talking about justification and justify, but he's all the way in righteousness. Same thing, same word, same principle, same concept. And we're going to prove that in part 2. The law given to Moshe says and teaches justification or righteousness by obedience, not by the law itself, but by obedience to the law given to Moshe, right? My last point is, given these two factors, given the fact that Paul said that he was teaching the law, he obeyed the law, he believed the law, and the law says justification and righteousness is come by being obedient to the divine teachings, which is called Torah, or the law given to Moshe or Moses, right? Since those are the factors, then it should follow that Paul believes that the law given to Moshe is the righteousness by which men will be judged and justified. Therefore, if Paul believes that, Paul must believe that we can, are, and will be declared righteous or justified by the law of Moses. This is logically sound. Now, if Paul doesn't believe that the law of Moses brings righteousness and it defines righteousness and it justified, it's the mark and the goal that we're going to be measured against in the day of judgment, right? It's important that us folk know what standard we're being held by, right? Do we just have to believe? Is the Most High going to judge how much belief that we have? I'm talking about according to the Bible, according to what I just read you. But we're going to prove it, right? Revelations, John, toward the end of the 1st century, says, you know what? I saw dead people, and they was before the throne. And the book of life was opened up. And he was reading and looking at their works, and he judged everyone according to their works. Didn't say belief there. I'm sorry. I didn't get into it, but Hamashiach himself says the very same thing, right? So this is a logical hypothesis. Just to recap, if Paul said he believed in everything and he followed everything written in the law, and he did, and we'll prove it, and the law teaches that justification and righteousness come by obedience to the law, and it does, and we'll prove it, then either Paul believes the same thing that his ancient Israelite ancestors believed, or Paul lied. It's just that simple. Paul lied, and we should no longer believe or follow anything Paul said, because he's a false prophet, he's a liar, and that's it. I don't believe that. And I'm going to prove that that's not the case. But this is the prevailing view. This is what modern day Christendom teaches. Paul taught against the law. I'm trying to tell you, they use these verses that I just used to say, you see, Paul said righteousness don't come by the law. Well, that goes against what Moses and all the prophets says, and what the ancient Israelites believe. And not only that, what Peter, James, John, and all of the apostles that actually followed and walked with Christ believe. Right? So we're going to solve that problem. Now, what did Paul believe? What did he believe? Let's see. Paul's own testimony. Paul believed in the teachings, we just said that, found in the law and the prophets. How do I know that? Acts chapter number 24, verses 14 through 15 in the ESV. But this I confess to you, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship. Notice that word worship in the present tense. Right now, look it up. For those of you guys that have your blue letter Bibles, excuse me, I'm not going to do it for the interest of time, but that statement, I worship, is in the present tense, meaning this is what I do now. I worship the Elohim, or the God of our fathers, believing, once again, in the present tense. Right now, this is what I believe. Now, I'm going to stop there. Paul, before Felix, was 58 or 59 AD. The importance of that is Paul was converted to the way between 34 and 35 AD. That would make this like 25, 30 years later. Paul is at the end of his ministry. He's at the end of his life. This is not in the beginning. This is why it's important, right? To bring the historical context. What was going on at the time? What time period does this take place in? It's called the setting, right? So Paul before Felix, 58 AD, and Paul made a confession of faith. So why wouldn't we go and see what Paul confessed himself, right? Well, that's what we're doing. This is exhibit number A. I'm not with, right? Write down, you can quote that's lawlessness and telling you that you're not justified law given Moshe. Scared to say I'm justified by law. As long as I obey law, I'm justified. Because on Judge Day, that's what's going to justify me in that law, according to the Old Testament and the New. The only difference is your opinion of what Paul said, which does not agree with what Paul said himself, clearly, like in this text. Acts chapter number 24, verse number 14 through 15. But this I confess to you, that according to the way, right? The way. This is the defender of the way, right? What is the way? That as well in a broadcast. So for those of you guys that haven't done so, you certainly want to go ahead and subscribe to this channel. For those of you guys that are watching, please help us get this message out and share this video. Not only like it, share it so we can get this message out and combat this false doctrine that's based on ignorance and tradition of men. Right? Right? We're blowing the shofar. We have an uphill battle. We're going against the prevailing view. The prevailing view is Paul taught against the law. Paul said that we don't have to follow the law. Paul said justification don't come by the law. And it appears on the surface that that's the case. But when you take the language understanding and get to the allow English to take back to the Greek, the Latin, and the Greek and the Latin to take you back into Hebrew, then things become to get more clear. And since Paul said he was teaching Torah, then we got to see what Torah says, right? Right? Acts chapter number 17, the Bereans were more noble than the Thessalonians. Why? Because they believed everything Paul said right off the bat, right? Nope. Guess what they did? They were called noble because they took Paul's doctrine and waited alongside of the law. They went to the Tanakh. They went to the Old Testament to see if what Paul was teaching was so. And this is what we're doing in this series, right? We're doing the Berean thing, right? Right? Not the ignorant thing, right? The Berean thing, right? And so it says, I worship the Elohim of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets. And I'm going to speed this along because I don't want to be too long, and I want to give you guys opportunity to answer questions and rebuttals. I can't see who's in the room right now. I appreciate all of you guys that are tuned in and all of that good stuff. All right. So now, this I confess unto you, So this is Paul's verbal confession of faith in 58 AD. You got to remember these time frames. That help you put it in perspective. This is not something that Paul started off believing because he was still kind of mixed up into Judaism. He hadn't fully came out yet. Nah, Paul died in 68, between 64 and 68. Doesn't that tell you that if he's saying this in 58 AD, that's the end of his life? And Paul, this is Paul's confession of faith at the end of his life. And Paul said, I confess that this is extracted out of the text. This is what you call exegesis. I'm not adding what tradition told me into the text. What you guys see on the screen, I took word for word pretty much out of the text itself. Right? Not opinion, right? Not my theology, right? Not eisegesis, right? Adding into the text, right? Pulling exactly what the text says out of the text itself. So now, I confess that according to the way which they call a sect, which was the Nazarenes, and wow, I gotta do this. The sect that they was talking about meant that whatever Paul was doing was a part and parcel of Judaism. Second Temple Judaism. Not another religion, but just a split. You had the Nazarenes, you had the Essenes, you had the Sadducees, the Pharisees, right? Different sects of practicing Judaism, what they call Judaism. This is what it means by a sect, or in some translations, a cult. So for those of you waywalkers out there, when folks say, oh, you're in a cult, and then be glad, right? Look it up. Take your blue letter Bible, do a translation comparison, right? Translation comparison, not just saying, well, I'm going to just read the King James, or well, I'm going to read the ESV. Do a comparison, right? Right? So you get the full picture. But anyway, I confess that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the Elohim of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law. Laid down by the law. Did you see that term? That means everything regulated by the law and written in the prophets, right? This is Paul's words out of his own mouth. Paul said in his verbal confession, the 2 points that we're making here is I worship according to the way. That means that Paul was following the Hebrew customs. This is what Paul was telling Felix, because Felix understood. If you read the context of that passage, Felix understood the customs. He was married to a Yahudim, what would be called a Jew, a Jewess, a female. His wife was a Jew, a Yahudim. So he was familiar with the customs. And Paul is actually defending himself against the accusations that he taught against the law. The same accusations that is the prevailing view today. Paul is actually in this text defending against that. Paul said, I worship, the way that I live is according to the way. In other words, the Hebrew customs. They are lying. I didn't break no Hebrew customs. And if you read on in the passage, Felix agrees with him and say, yeah, I know the law. I know they lying. But since you appealed to Caesar, then I'm going to send you to Caesar. But right now, I'm going to send you to Agrippa to get you out of town before they kill you. Context. Historical context. Not some history somebody told me. I got this from the book of Acts. Directly from the book. The second part was, I believe everything established by the law and written in the prophets. Now, if Paul believed everything written in the law, and this confession of Paul's is true, then what Paul taught should be the law. What Paul believed about justification, what that's till the plus study in being my 3 months righteousness, justice, judgment, vindication, all of those synonyms of justified. Went through all of them. Taking what Paul said, everything that he said on justification, not just the parts that seem like they agree, everything. Even the ones that the prevailing view says contradicts what I'm giving you guys here now, which you see is logically based, following the scientific method, and making sure we use the Bible precept upon precept, right? So we're building on this. We're going to build on Paul's own testimony, and we're going to see if Paul is going to pan out, or we should call Paul an apostate for lying, right? For being a hypocrite, for getting in front of Felix and say, listen, I believe in everything laid down. Not I believed in the past tense, but in the present tense. This is the way I worship. I worship the same way that the ancient Israelites, my ancestors, worship. That's what Paul said. Now, that was Exhibit A. Exhibit B, and I'm going to move this on because I don't want to be more than an hour. I don't know how long. I think, I've been on here half an hour, I'm guessing. So we got a little bit of time. Exhibit B is a physical confession. Now, what I just gave you was a verbal confession. In this physical confession, Paul not only said that he believed and he was following, because, you know, folk can actually say one thing and do another. They can actually say, I believe this, I believe that, out of their mouth, but really they don't believe it when it comes to their actions. Their actions betray their speech, right? And so Paul actually demonstrated to a group of folk his obedience to the Kahal, in fact, in Jerusalem, to the teachings found in the law, in the prophets. So not only was Paul believe, not only did he believe, Paul was obedient to. In other words, he was keeping the teachings found in the law and in the prophets. This is another fact, biblical, historical fact, that majority of Christendom just do not know. And you just watch the comments, you're going to get a bunch of folk on here. Oh, you wrong, ad hominem, all these logical fallacies. But they're never going to address these issues, these facts. This is a fact. This is a fact. I didn't make it up. I'm about to show you myself. Paul demonstrated his obedience, that he followed himself. So now, for those of you guys that follow Pauline Christianity, why aren't you following Paul? Paul said, follow me as I follow Christ. And Paul continued to keep the law. According to what Paul said, what Luke said, what Epiphanius, who was a 4th century bishop, said, right? A historical source, right? Not just a biblical source, but an extra biblical source in history. Because see, we don't do like those that most of the Christian apologists do, right? Oh, this is what we believe. This is what we was taught. This is what I went to school. So I'm going to stand on that. You got to believe it by faith. No. I believe it was Paul told you to prove all things. He didn't just say, oh, just believe it. Right? Prove all things. So now, Paul was actually obedient to the teachings found in the law and the prophets. How do we know this? Once again, now we're going backwards because we just talked about Felix. And I don't know if the Most High wanted it this way or I messed up or what have you. But this is actually going backwards. It's in 58 AD. However, it's just before Paul gets before Felix. So once again, this is at the end of Paul's life. Now let's see what's going on in this text. Remember I told you that Paul demonstrated that he was actually obedient, that he himself not only believed, but he obeyed the divine teachings found in the law of Moshe and the prophets, right? Acts chapter number 21, verse number 23 and 24. Do therefore what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Now, wait a minute. This is James and the elders and the Kahal, or what the world calls the church, at Jerusalem in 58 AD. James likely died in 64. This would make this 6 years before James's death. Why is James in a temple, got some followers of the way who are under his tutelage and authority? Why are they making vows, Nazirite vows under the law? But we're not going to get into that, right? That would be a red herring. I just wanted to make that. We want to stay on topic. Take these men and purify yourself with them. Make a Nazirite vow, Paul, under the law, along with them, and pay for their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Look it up. It's in the book of Numbers. I don't know why 25 is coming to my mind, but don't quote me on that. But look up the Nazirite vow. It's going to tell you they shave their heads. Why is Paul doing this? Why is he being told to do this? Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. So now what's going on here is there's rumors going around that Paul is teaching against the law of Moses, like the prevailing view. James and the rest of the apostles is hearing that Paul said we're not justified by the law. Paul said righteousness don't come by the law. Paul said if you try to be justified by the law, you didn't fell from grace. Right? These are those rumors. The text itself tell you. We don't have to guess that. It's going to tell you that in here. Right? So now, James and the rest of the apostles, all these zealous for the law folk who are keeping the law, and we say we follow the apostles. I came out of the apostolic church. Oh, because we follow the apostles' doctrine. Well, what we're seeing here is the apostles actually not only keeping the law, but making sure that Paul was keeping the law too. I mean, this is just a fact, right? I didn't make it up. Don't get mad at me. Don't add harmony to me. Don't come after me. Go after Luke, who wrote the book of Acts. All right? So now, Paul is after hearing all these rumors, James said, wait a minute. I know you can't be teaching against the law, Paul. I don't believe that. So I tell you what, I want you to prove that you're not teaching what the prevailing view is saying that you're teaching. I need you to prove that you yourself are obedient to the law given to Moshe. This is a biblical fact, folks. Biblical fact, right? So let's see what Paul does. Acts chapter number 21, verse 26 through 28. Then Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them and went into the temple. So now, not only did Paul confess before Felix, that was after this event, but what led up to this event is this one right here. Paul went in the temple, he purified himself, he got 4 other disciples there that are purified, observing the law given to Moses, even though we're told that that was done and over with at the cross, right? Law and Christ nailed the law to the cross, right? Right? They use Colossians out of context, as we're going to see, because it conflicts with Paul said that how do I know that? Because it conflicts with Paul said he believed in, and Paul is making a public display and a demonstration to show that he was following. It's a contradiction. Doesn't matter if you admit it or not, right? It is, in fact, a contradiction, right? So Paul took the men, and the next day he purified himself along with them and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, and the offering. Guess what? That's a sin offering. 30 years after Christ died, buried, and resurrected again. Look it up in the book of Numbers. Don't have time to get into it, but you Bible scholars know what I'm talking about. Right? You that keep the way, that follow the divine teachings, you know exactly what I'm talking about, right? And so until the days be fulfilled, and that an offering should be presented for each one of them. Now, there's a theory that he didn't actually make this sacrifice, but later on in his text, it tells you that he actually did. So I'm not even going to get into that. But when the crazy apologist folk come out and say, well, he didn't actually do it, which still would be a red herring, distracting from the point that he actually confessed to believe, verbally confessed to believing in the law. And now we have him here demonstrating his physical obedience to the divine teachings given to Moshe, which we call Torah, and the world calls the law, right? So now what happened, it says, and when the 7 days was almost completed, the Yahudim from Asia, remember that, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying out, men of Yisrael, help, this is the man who is teaching, right? So now folks say, oh, well, you don't know what Paul was teaching. You don't know who was accusing him. All of these red herring irrelevant arguments. The fact is, we have it in writing from Luke, a primary historical and textual source here, right? Right? Doesn't matter what the church fathers say, this person say, that person say, this scholar said, this. Well, if their opinions does not match up with this, doesn't matter what title they have on their name, they are wrong. And their doctrine is biblically, historically, and linguistically or philologically unsound, right? So the complaint was, this is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere. What was he teaching? Against the people, against the Jews. Y'all ain't the chosen people no more. Ain't that what we heard? Y'all been replaced by the church. And the law. So he was teaching against the people, the law, and the temple, or this place, because they was in the temple. So that's what the rumors is. And these confessions, these testimonies that we are reviewing are actually in response. This is called context, y'all. Context. Textual and historical context. Right? So against the people, against the law, this place. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple, a lie, and has defiled this holy place. All of this is a lie. And we're going to prove it, right? This is why Paul demonstrated, well, we just proved it. Paul demonstrated that this was not true. This is the rumors that that James had heard, and all of the congregation at Jerusalem, which included Cephas or Peter. And this is what Paul gave his testimony before Felix about. And remember, Felix knew the law. Read the text. His wife was a Jew. She was a Yahudim. And so he was very familiar, even though he was a Roman, he was very familiar with the law. And he found Paul not guilty. That should be exhibit B2 or whatever sub under this category. That's important. That's an important piece of evidence. Felix refused to discipline and execute Paul. He refused to give in to the whims of these liars that was promulgating the prevailing view that we see today, that Paul was teaching against the law. Paul made this public display that he wasn't, at the behest of James and the Kahal at Jerusalem. Then he went before Felix a second time. So this would make Paul a double liar. If in fact he was teaching that the Jewish people, Yahudim, the Jews, don't matter anymore. That the law doesn't matter anymore. The Torah, that's not what saved. If the law is sin, if you try to keep it, it's over for you. You have no grace. These are the same doctrines that are promulgated and popular and is foundational to Christendom. Paul himself denied here in this text. This is a primary source, primary historical and textual source. This is Luke. Right? Right? This is not Sam. I didn't make this up, right? So now, let's get into it. So now, if we summarize the passage, I pretty much already did that. It says, do therefore what we tell you. Thus all will know. Why are you doing this? So that everybody will know that this rumor that you spoke against the temple, that you were speaking against the law, that you said justification don't come by the law, that we not righteous by the law, even though the law said that we was, even though that the Most High himself in the law said that it was. You're going to prove that there's nothing to these rumors and that you yourself live in obedience of the law. Right? Right? The modern Christian in response to this, I've heard it a lot. Well, Paul was just doing this because he said, I became all things to all people, to the Jews, I became a Jew, to the Greeks, I became a Greek. And this is why Paul, which would make Paul a hypocrite, because he judged Peter for the Cephas for the same thing in Galatians chapter number 2. When Cephas was eating with the Gentiles and certain came down from James. I ain't even gonna get into it, y'all, but that went over a lot of you guys here. When certain came from James, Peter jumped up, act like he wasn't eating with the Gentiles, and Paul rebuked his socks off, said, nah, bruh, you walking disorderly, you being a hypocrite. So now the Christians, apologists, and the prevailing view in Christendom want us to believe that Paul was playing the hypocrite here. He only did this so that he can keep them off their back. Pure, utter, inconsistent, nonsensical foolishness. That's all it is. Inconsistent. What I mean by inconsistent, it doesn't jive with Paul's own testimony before Felix. So now he was being a hypocrite before Felix. He was being a hypocrite. So Paul is just a little lying chameleon, right? That's what Christendom makes Paul out to be. And you have some followers of the way that's caught up in this nonsense and say Paul was an apostate. Paul was a liar, he was a hypocrite, and if the prevailing view is true, then yes, Paul was a hypocrite and Paul was an apostate, and we should trash every writing that he wrote. But fortunately, that's not the case, and I'm going to prove that here. So Paul physically demonstrated that he observed, followed, and I'm closing, the law given to Moses, right? This is Exhibit C. It is another verbal confession. And what we're going to find here is that Paul confessed to teaching the exact same teachings found in the law and the prophets. Uh-oh. So now if Paul was teaching the exact same thing, why do we got Paul conflicting Paul in Romans 2 and 13 compared to Romans 3 and 20 in the same book? Why do we got Paul seemingly contradicting what the law says? Why is he contradicting what James and John said? By the way, John and James all agree with the law. They saying the same thing that the law say. The only one that's different is the modern interpretation, the prevailing interpretation that comes from Christendom that Paul taught against the law. That's a problem, because Paul said that he was teaching the exact same things contained in the law and the prophets. If this was court, the case be closed. It should have been closed. But I feel like Paul, I'm getting all of this flack about this truth because I said I am justified by obeying the divine teachings that was given to Moshe. Uh-oh, Sam then lost his mind. Sam is the lying devil. Oh, I've been getting it. Right? Just like Paul, just like they lied on Paul, they lie on the defender of the way. And so for those of you guys that are watching, please don't forget, or that will watch, please share this video. If it's been a blessing to you, please like it, share it so we can get this word out. I accept all challenges. It doesn't matter where they come from, atheist, apostle, presiding prelate, bishop, pope, whatever. I accept them all. We can sit down and we can go through this text, go through the textual evidence, the historical evidence, and the philological evidence, and compare that with whatever position that you have in a cordial and orderly and respectful manner. We can disagree without being disagreeable. As long as you don't get to acting the fool, you won't get cut too deep, right? And so Paul confessed to teaching the exact same teachings found in the law and the prophets, right? Did he? Well, let's verify that. Paul's testimony before Agrippa. So now he done left Felix testifying, according to Christendom, test the lion, because he was just faking the funk so he can get out of being killed, or get out of pissing the Yahudim from Asia, the Jews from Asia off, right? Acts 26 and 22. Now, this is just about a year later. Paul's been booked. He's been locked up for a year, right? Acts 26, 22 through 23 in the ESV. To this day, I have had the help that comes from the Elohim. And so I stand here testifying both to small and great. What was my testimony? What was I teaching? Remember, 59 AD. This is 30 years after, just about 27, 26, whatever the numbers are, years after Paul's conversion, and a few years before his death, maybe about a decade, 6 to 10 years before his death, the end of Paul's life, the end of Paul's ministry. And Paul is saying, so to put this in perspective, Galatians is already written. 1st and 2nd Corinthians is already written. And I think it's 1st Thessalonians was already written. But the majority of the 7 authentic books that we know for a fact belongs to Paul were already written. Romans, already written. He wrote it about a month before or a few weeks before Acts chapter number 21. Right? Context, right? Acts 26:23, to this day I've had the help that comes from the Elohim, and so I stand here testifying both to small and great. What was I testifying to? Saying nothing. I've never said anything but what the prophets and Moses said. Right? What the prophets and Moses said would come to pass, that the Christ must suffer, and that being the first to rise from the dead, he would proclaim light both to our people and to the Goyim, the Gentiles, right? And that light is Torah. So not only is he preaching the death, burial, and resurrection of Hamashiach as the fulfillment of prophecy, he was preaching Torah straight out of the book of Moses. That's what that light is. Thy word is a light unto my feet and a lamp unto my path. And I'm not even going to get into that. I've had some challenges on that. I welcome those as well, and I'll have you on the panel, and we can go through it, right? And so Paul specifically and clearly says that he was teaching nothing but what the prophets and Moses taught. So now, to recap, I think I'm going to do a recap in here, and then I'm going to be done. This is at the end, and I'll open up the panel. Oh, no. Acts 28 and 23. So now Paul is in Rome. So he then went before James. He made a public display that he was keeping the law by taking a Nazirite vow. They came and arrested him because the Jews in Asia was about to beat on him, or were beating on him. And so he went before Lysias. Lysias sent him before Felix. Felix sent him before Agrippa, and Agrippa sent him to Rome to appear before Nero, right? And so when they had, let's see what he was doing in Rome while he was on house arrest, right? While he was on the box, right? When they had appointed a day for him, they came to him at his lodging in greater numbers. From morning to evening, he expounded to them. What was Paul preaching? Testifying to the kingdom of the Elohim. I pause so you guys can get that. People say Paul was preaching the gospel. Paul, all he preached was a death, burial, and resurrection. Wrong. That was the goal. That was mostly what Paul taught. But Paul taught the law, the kingdom of the Elohim, the order, the divine teachings, the logos theos, the Debar Elohim, right? In the Hebrew, right? Testifying to the kingdom of God and trying to convince them about Yeshua or Yahusha, both from the law, or Jesus, both from the law given to Moses or Moshe or Moises, and from the prophets, the Nebaim. So Paul was preaching not only Jesus or Yahusha, Yeshua, whatever name you apply to him, both from the law given to Moshe and from the prophets. So he preached two things. You'll hear that apology. Oh, he just preached Jesus. No, he didn't. That's false, according to Paul himself, right? And so the key point here is that Paul was testifying to the kingdom of the Elohim about Yahusha from the law, the Torah, the Old Testament, given to Moshe, and from the Nebaim, the prophets, right? The Old Testament. Lastly, Paul's letters to the Corinthians. Now we're going back because remember I told you Paul's letters to the Corinthians was written before he made his confession of faith. Right? So the context of these letters, when people talk about the context, Romans, Galatians, they don't have a clue. The context is that Paul is defending these charges that he taught against the law. He said you wasn't justified by the law. He said you wasn't declared righteous by the law. These letters, these testimonies are in response to those claims, which make it the context, right? 1 Corinthians 7 and 10. Remember, now we're talking about Exhibit C. We're talking about Paul himself and proving that Paul himself said that he was teaching the law. Nothing more, nothing less than what's in the law. Now, what we're going to do is investigate that and see if that is in fact the case, but we know for a fact that Paul said that. 1 Corinthians 7 and 10, to the married I give this charge, not I, but Yahuwah. The wife should not, or Adonai, the wife should not separate from her husband. Now, the point that we're noticing here is that this commandment that he's given, he's saying, I didn't give this. This is not what I'm, right? Where did it come from? Torah. 1 Corinthians 9 and 8. Say I these things as a man? Once again, Paul is saying again. Or saith the law the same thing also? This is witness number 2 to Paul actually saying that I am teaching nothing more than the law and the prophets. I didn't make that up. It's not my opinion. It is a biblical fact. 1 Corinthians 14 and 34, let your women keep silent in the church, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience. Why are they commanded to be under obedience, Paul? Because Paul made it up. It's a new law, new doctrine, new way, right? Because also, as also saith the law. Paul is making a point to point out to these Gentiles. Notice that Paul is writing to Gentiles. And he's making a point to prove to these Gentiles that what he's teaching is actually in the law. My goodness gracious, right? 1 Corinthians 14 and 37. If any man think himself to be a prophet or spiritual, let him acknowledge that the things that I write unto you are the commandments of the Adonai. Right? He says it again. This is 4 times. 4. What I'm teaching, what I've been teaching is nothing more than what's written in the law and in the prophets. In other words, I am teaching the exact same thing as the law and the prophets. This came out of Paul's mouth. Right? So now, and this is the conclusion, what we've shown you here to summarize, remember from our scientific method, we had to take a problem and propose questions. And the question on the table now is, what did Paul believe? And it's very relevant because if he believed one thing and taught another one, that would make Paul a hypocrite, a false prophet, a sinner, disqualified. Right? And so Paul believed in everything written in the law given to Moshe. Proven that here. 2, what we've shown is Paul's actions. Paul believes in everything written in, oh my goodness, I didn't change this. I thought I did. Well, Paul demonstrated, this should be, I apologize for that. Paul demonstrated his obedience to the law of Moses should be under Paul's actions. And Paul's teaching, Paul said that he was teaching nothing more than what was written in the law and in the prophets, right? These are Paul's words. So Paul believed the law, Paul followed and obeyed the law, and Paul taught the law. So now we have a problem. in which we'll get into in part 3. We're going to compare Paul's writings to the law. In part number 2, we're going to actually get into the law and see what the law says. Before we do that, or in the process, we're going to define exactly, etymologically, philologically, linguistically, what the term righteous or justified means in the English, how that compares to the Greek, and how the Greek compares to the Hebrew. Both the English and the Greek compares to the Hebrew. So you definitely want to tune in for that. This concludes this part 1 of the session. If you guys have questions, I don't know, I can't see. Let me go back to the screen there, get back to the StreamYard. Okay. All right. So, okay, I see that we got a couple questions here. I see my brother Shalom, Yahweh War Machine in the building, Sister Sheikah, Andre Bell. And any other questions out there? The panel is now open. If you guys want to, anyone want to come on the panel, have something to say, have a contradiction, or what have you, the panel is open. The floor is open. Justification. The law versus Paul. This has been part 1 of the series, and what we just went through was Paul's own testimony. Paul clearly said that he believed in the law. It says that he followed the law and that he was teaching the law. So now what we're going to do in part 2, which will be next week, so make sure you guys tune into that on next week. Most High willing, we have it set up for next week. We're going to see exactly what the law says. Since Paul says that he was teaching the law, he believed in the law, we're going to see what the law says about righteousness. How are we declared righteous? What is righteousness? We're going to see that. We're going to actually get into the text and see that. I appreciate all of you guys that tuned in, that will tune in. Please do not forget to like, share, and subscribe. I see you, brother Yahuda Ben Yisrael, in the building. I appreciate you. Shalom, bro. And if we don't have any questions, I don't see any questions. Even if you have questions after we close this broadcast, go ahead and post the questions in the comments, and we will get back to them. I see, brother Yahuda, let me see. We have one question. Let's see if I can get this on the board. There was one scholar that said he wanted to know if Paul was pro-law or not. So he read hours and hours for days, and he came to the conclusion that he still don't know if Paul was pro-law or not. Good post, good comment, brother Yahuda Ben Yisrael. Yeah, it can be confusing if you don't understand that Paul was dealing with different types of law. In the first century, you had oral Torah, which was still called the law of Moses. You had the written Torah, of course, that's called the law of Moses. Then you had the deeds or the works of the law at the same time, which was called the law of Moses, even though they were written ordinances of men based on their interpretations of Torah. And so that was called the law. And the sacrificial system, which was added because of sin, was called the law of Moses. There was only one term. Even the Roman law was used by the term nomia, or nomos, nomos, which just means law. And so this is why they get confused. And this is why we're going to start with, what did Paul say himself? Okay, and we'll go through that, and then we'll look at some of these contradictory texts in part 3. We're going to take these texts of what Paul said, match them up with the law, match them up with what he said in other sections of his writings, and other parts of his writings, and other writings, and make some sense of them there. And so that's what this series is all about. If you guys have any further questions, or those of you guys that see this that will see this, go ahead and post your questions, and we'll respond to them at a later date. So I appreciate all of you guys tuning in. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And I'm going to say shalom.